At the end of the day, if you have terrible retention, the other parts of the engine don't really matter.
Brian Balfour was VP of Growth at Hubspot and is now the founder of Reforge.
Why is retention the core of growth?
The company with the best retention in any specific category is going to end up being the winner. Retention essentially interacts with all different parts of your growth model. The more customers you retain ends up driving your acquisition loops. Viral-driven loop or even a paid loop, the longer you retain a customer, the more interaction points to drive those specific loops.
So why are funnels dead? And why should people think in growth loops?
If you actually look behind the engine of every high growth company, there is more of a system that looks like a self-reinforcing loop, where I put an input into the system, it produces an output, and that output can be reinvested in the input. If you want to grow at a very high pace and at a very sustainable pace, you have to build these self-reinforcing systems within your product and within your growth strategy.
Reforge is one of my favorite product and growth learning platforms. Seats for Reforge's courses usually cost $1,995. And lots of companies I've worked at, like Apollo.io, pay for them for the whole product team. I've taken many of their courses. In today's episode with Reforge's founder, Brian Balfour, I've tried my best to extract all the insights from him and present you a crash course on my favorite Reforge lessons. Part 1 is about product growth foundations. Part 2 is growth strategy. Part 3 is mastering AI, and Part 4 is mastering AI strategy. He goes into tremendous depth you can't find anywhere else. Really quickly, I think a crazy stat is that more than 50% of you listening are not subscribed. If you can subscribe on YouTube, follow on Apple or Spotify podcasts, my commitment to you is that we'll continue to make this content better and better. And now on to today's episode. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I've been a huge fan of Reforge, as I was saying, and today I really want to give people a crash course into what it's like to take those courses. And we're going to start with one of my favorites, which is product growth foundations. And I think we start with kind of one of those philosophical questions about growth and what growth even is. And you guys have a point of view on that, which is retention is really important. Why is retention the core of growth?
Yeah, so Product Growth Foundations was the OG course. It was originally named Growth Series, and then we ended up kind of recently renaming it. But that was the one that Andrew Chen and I initially created, and the origin story behind it was just he and I were thinking about doing something similar, and we had all these thoughts and frameworks and things in our head, and we were like, you know what, let's just dump this on a whole kind of series of slides and see what happens. And that was kind of the origin point for Reforge. And one of the core lessons that we kind of came out with right away was one is like, how do we teach growth in a more systematic way? So basically, what are the big parts of the engines to growth? And then like, what is the system that surrounds that engine that continually tunes it and optimizes and maintains it, improves it over time? And the three parts of the engine are essentially acquisition, retention, and monetization. And most people kind of go in that order when they think about things, but we actually flipped it and we said, actually, we need to start with retention. And the reason is like we kind of consider it the core, the centerpiece of any growth engine. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but if you actually look historically across all of the different categories, and the top company in any specific category always has the best retention by far. So literally there's quantitative evidence that says the company with the best retention in any specific category is going to end up being the winner. And that goes like through like consumer social and the early social networks to the photo apps to specific B2B companies and all that kind of stuff. And actually in this day and age in AI, it's even more important because I feel like with this first wave of AI apps, everybody's forgot this foundational principle and everybody kind of needs some reminding.
Today's episode is brought to you by Gibson AI, the future of backend development. Imagine a world where designing, deploying, and scaling your database is as intuitive as having a conversation. Gibson AI makes that a reality. Gibson AI is your very own AI database engineer. In just minutes, you can chat with Gibson to design production-grade data models, automatically generate secure REST APIs, and even eliminate technical debt that's been holding your team back. Whether you're launching a brand new product or modernizing an existing app, Gibson AI handles everything from data migrations to integration, so you can focus on building what matters most. Gibson AI is built for the modern engineering team, empowering you to accelerate development, reduce tedious coding, and deliver powerful solutions faster than ever before. Head over to gibsonai.com/Aakash to experience the future of automated data modeling. That's gibsonai.com/AAKASH and use code Aakash50 for 50% off your first 12 months. Trust isn't just earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or more complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs across over 35 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. Centralized security workflows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. Vanta can help you start or scale your security program by connecting you with auditors and experts to conduct your audit and set up your security program quickly. Plus, with automation and AI throughout the platform, Vanta gives you time back, so you can focus on building your company. Join over 9,000 global companies like Atlassian, Quora, and Factory who use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. For a limited time, my listeners get $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/Aakash. That's VANTA.com/AAKASH for $1,000 off.
That this is the foundation. This is the thing that creates the best, the biggest, the longest term sustainable pieces. And the main reason is that retention essentially interacts with all different parts of your growth model. And I think we're going to talk about growth models later. But essentially, the more customers you retain, typically that ends up driving what we call like your acquisition loops. So if you have like a content or viral driven loop or even a paid loop, the longer you retain a customer, the more interaction points to drive those specific loops. So actually retention drives acquisition. And in a similar way, retention drives monetization as well. If you look at any different type of monetization model, the longer you retain or the more customers you retain, essentially the more touch points you have to upgrade them, expand them, get them to kind of invite, their other like customers, to the team, like those different pieces. And so in the same way, retention drives monetization. And so, yes, these are all three really important parts of the engine. But at the end of the day, if you have terrible retention, the other parts of the engine don't really matter. It's not really a sustainable product or business. And that's kind of why we see a bunch of these AI apps right now in today's environment. It reminds me of the early Facebook platform days where you see these like DAO MAU numbers kind of like skyrocket through the roof. And it's just a matter of time until they fall back down to earth. And as a result, you just like actually never get the opportunity to continue building on top of it. So that's kind of why we consider retention the core and the foundation of growth, and why we spend so much time there and think about that so deeply.
I think that in and of itself, for people who aren't practicing growth day in and day out, is like a key takeaway here, which you have to focus on retention. But when you want to focus on something, you have to measure it. And I think that this is where a lot of people get tripped up. You mentioned that DAO MAU metric. There's lots of interesting ways to measure engagement or retention that may not always be the best. How can someone define the retention metric?
Well, yeah, so you're actually touching on a few things. Like people make a lot of big mistakes around this, right? Of course, one of the big mistakes is that they just kind of borrow retention metrics from other companies, even ones in the same category. Or another one is that they actually conflate retention and engagement together. Those are actually two very different things. Retention is a binary thing. It's answering the question, is somebody, still retained, some time period later? It's a yes or no question, 1 or 0. And then engagement is about, okay, if yes, if they are still retained in that period, how deeply engaged they are. And there's different dimensions you can measure engagement. And oftentimes those two things get muddled together, and as a result ends up pointing people like in the wrong direction. And so in Reforge, we have this tool that we call the use case map. It's actually a very simple tool, but basically walks people through the chain of thought on how to go from like first principles around the problem you're solving all the way to how you measure retention, all the way down to like your activation and your engagement metrics, which are second, third order things that you want to define after retention. And so basically what the use case map does is it starts with the problem. It asks the question, okay, what is the problem that you are solving? And ideally you put it in the customer's words. And then it goes through, okay, why are they choosing your solution over the other solutions? What is the alternatives that they're considering? Not the competitors, the alternatives, because most big products are competing with alternatives, not competitors. And eventually gets to the real question that you're trying to answer, which is, well, what is the natural frequency that this problem occurs in our target audience's life, right? And that's the key, like, and that's why you have to walk through all of those steps, because the answer to that question, even if your product, take two CRM products, if you're targeting different segments of the market, you might be solving a similar problem, but two segments of the market. Well, that problem might actually occur naturally at different rates of those two segments of the market. And that's why you have to kind of go through that progression. And once you can answer that question, what is the natural frequency of the problem occurring in our target audience's life? That's the start of defining your retention metric. That's the frequency. So your answer to that might be daily, it might be weekly, it might be monthly, it might be, a few times a quarter. In some low frequency cases, it could be yearly, even multi-yearly. It could be all of these different things. But you start there and then you define essentially, okay, what is the action within my product that indicates that we are solving the problem for that user? And then the third step is essentially saying, how do I want to define the user that I'm measuring, retention for? So a lot of products have different types of users. Airbnb has hosts and guests. Slack typically has like first user, second plus user, right? That take very different behaviors. Even in Reforge, we basically have a end user, like leader sort of dynamic, within a lot of our B2B accounts. And at the end of this, you basically have the frequency, you have the action, and you have the defined persona, and you put those three together, and that's where you end up with a retention. That's where you end up with a retention metric. Now, a lot of people, along with this metric, when they go through defining it, in addition to all the mistakes that I mentioned, is that they tend to want to be a higher frequency product than what their natural frequency actually says. And the reason for that is that low frequency products are just actually very hard to build, very, very hard to build. But that sets people up for that actually sets people up incorrectly. This metric that you define is more than just a metric. It's more than just measuring results. It's going to shape how your team thinks about what they prioritize and what they build. Well, I'll just take a super simple example, right? If you have like a monthly use case, but you're setting your retention metric at like weekly or daily, your team might define notification systems that are going out daily, weekly, trying to build a daily, weekly habit. Well, to a customer that actually is only experiencing the problem on a monthly frequency, what does that feel like? That just feels like overwhelmed. It feels like spam. It's a terrible product experience, right? And the problem ends up in the reverse direction too. If you set too low of a bar, then you aren't hitting people at the right parts to like build a habit around the product. And so I warn people like, hey, like this isn't just an exercise to set a metric that you can measure progress against and set goals at. It's actually going to shape how your team thinks and builds around the product. And that's why it's so important to think about this from first principles versus just kind of borrowing from other situations, whether that's your own historical ones or others that you listen to.
Maybe we can take an example of a product that a lot of people know about. You mentioned Airbnb. So if we were thinking about Airbnb guest retention, how do we walk through the use case map to define our retention metric?
Well, first you have to divide between guest and host, right? So the problems are very different between those two folks. And at Airbnb side, like even on the guest side, you might actually want to divide that further, right? You might have like business travelers and like entertainment travelers. Let's just call it. But for most folks, people on the guest side use use Airbnb maybe a couple times a year, right? Something like that. So their frequency is going to be about yearly, is kind of where I probably initially set it. And so then the question is like, okay, uh, what action in the product would indicate that we are solving this problem? The problem being, I want a convenient place to stay that's not a hotel. That ends up because their alternative is a hotel. Um, and uh, and so the action there is like pretty clear. It's like they book a place, right? And on the host side, and then on the host side, it's totally different, right? If I have a place that I'm trying to book for guests, the frequency might actually probably be more like weekly, right? Like that I'm booking somebody on a weekly basis. And very similar there, it's like a weekly active host, active there might be, you could either set it on a host night booked, or it might be like some kind of like interaction with the guest side of the business, right? Like a chat back and forth, like something like that if you want a little bit more of a weekly indicator. But essentially, I kind of fast forwarded through those, but you're essentially walking through the different problems all the way to the natural frequency. And one thing about this is that as your use case map evolves over time, right? Early on in Airbnb, the main why to the alternative was actually around price, right? It was like I could find cheaper places, right? Then it kind of turned into over time. It kind of evolved into things like I could get like a more unique place, right? Or in locations that I couldn't, where hotels didn't exist, like all of these types of things. And so dimensions of your use cases can actually evolve over time. And that's why you should always be coming back to this, probably on at least a yearly basis, maybe a bit more frequently, especially in today's AI environment where everything feels like it's changing every single day. But yeah, once again, it's a tool to define once, but come back to over and over and again.
So you've got your measurement framework set up for retention. You feel like you're probably looking at the right things. What are the main ways to improve retention? I think people generally think about improving engagement, improving activation, and improving resurrection. Are those the right ways to focus, or how do you improve retention?
There's essentially three different buckets. So as we talked about, retention is a binary metric. It's a yes or no question. Is this person engaged 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 3 months, whatever the time period is after them like initially signing up, or engaging in your product? And so then there's like, yes, okay, how do I improve that binary metric? Meaning if I have 100 users in a specific cohort, how do I make sure 60 instead of 50 are retained at some period of time? And there's essentially three inputs, three levers, and you named them, right? There's activation, there's depth of engagement, and then there's essentially resurrection. And so activation is about how do you take a new user and establish the habit around your product for the first time? That's really, really important. It's about habit building. It is not about setting them up on the product. It is not about educating them about the product. It is about how do you get them all the way to establishing the habit with your product for the first time. Then there's engagement, and engagement is about depth. It's about depth of engagement. It's a depth metric. It's a spectrum. It's not a binary metric like retention is. And you can measure this on different dimensions, and the right dimension depends on your product. You can measure it based on time, right? So that would be something like YouTube, like you're probably watching right now, or Netflix, which is the depth of engagement for them is about how do we get our users to watch and spend as much time on this platform as possible. It can also be about feature usage. So at HubSpot, our strategy was an all-in-one marketing product for the mid market, and so we had what we called apps. They were it was basically features like social media monitoring, email automation, CMS, like all the different pieces, right? And it was very clear that the more features that people used in a time period correlated with higher long-term retention. So that's another dimension you could measure it on. So that's engagement. There's a couple other dimensions. And then there's resurrection. And Resurrection, most people really think about, well, okay, like how do I take users who, resurrection is about how do we, users who establish the habit at least once, but then fell off, how do we bring them back and reestablish the habit? And that's just, there's a lot of similarities to activation, but differences in the sense that you have a lot of historical information about this user, their patterns, other things. And so the journey back to establishing a habit is pretty different. There's some other mechanisms in there like churn prediction. And we throw that in the engagement bucket because that's more about how do I detect somebody is like falling out of habit? It means like how do you detect somebody's habit is decreasing? And as a result, you save them before they even get to the point of churn. But those end up being like the three different levers, and each one has their own specific metrics. And the key about the metrics is that you're able to initially at least correlate an improvement in activation or engagement to longer term retention, and then eventually, obviously, establish causation through experimentation.
Retention drives monetization, it drives acquisition. And one interesting intersection I've been marinating on more and more is sometimes your users are going to churn, but you can potentially improve your overall cohort's net revenue retention by selling new products or upselling the people who do stay with you. How does that fit into this as a growth strategy?
So in Reforge, we distinctly think about user and usage very differently than revenue retention. And the reason is because revenue retention is almost always an output of usage. So when thinking about retention, it's very easy to start with, okay, well, like I'm only I'm only retaining, or this cohort's only worth $10,000, and we need to get these cohorts to be worth $12,000 by X time period, but we need to retain more of the dollars. But yeah, it's just putting cart before the horse, right? If the user is not using the product, they will not continue paying for the product. Might take them a while to realize that they're still paying for a product that they aren't using, but they will realize at some point. And so the challenge is that if you just start optimizing for revenue retention before usage, you can end up optimizing yourself into the direction where you're collecting a lot of what I would call empty dollars. These are dollars that don't have real usage behind it. And yes, you can increase that metric in a short term and get some wins, but eventually you're going to hit a wall and you're going to actually have a much, much bigger problem. And so we think about these two things very distinctly from each other and really recommend, if you want to improve revenue retention and you have a retention initiative, it's really about increasing usage or time to value and activation, those pieces, and the revenue will follow. If you want to think about revenue retention, you should be really thinking about that more as part of your monetization efforts, not your retention efforts. Because retention is about how do you establish and build value. Money in monetization is about how do you extract value. And those two things are at odds with each other. And so you actually have to balance have to balance those two things versus try to think about them as one thing, because the more you extract value on monetization, that can have negative impacts on like usage and retention. And vice versa, right? Like you could really drive usage and retention and not really work on monetization, and you're not capturing enough value as well. So they're two totally different dimensions that I think that companies should be thinking about differently, though they intersect with clear trade-offs. And as a result, it's like the project that I feel like is always the hairiest project internally is anything around pricing and monetization. It's like, and like all at every company I've advised or anything, that is like the person that is at the center of that is like has to be somebody who just is ready to deal with like a complicated shit show, because it's such a complicated mess and has so many trade-offs with the other levers in your business.
Let's begin to unpack that monetization area. If you're conceptually Looking at a new product or a new company, what are the first components you look at to evaluate their monetization?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I look at is whether I think their monetization model is aligned with the size of their market and aligned with their growth channels. And growth model. So so as we talked about, like every company has an engine to growth, and there's many different types of engines, many different types of growth loops as part of that engine. And what your monetization model does is it either enables or disables specific types of growth loops and growth mechanisms like within that model. And oftentimes in an early stage startup, what I find is that the way that they're talking about growing is misaligned with how they are charging in monetizing the customer. This is especially relevant and especially clear in things like freemium and PLG models. And there's a lot of case studies and examples that we've done and others have published now, right? So a classic example here is Miro, where Elena Verna was one of the advisors at the time. She was the creator of our monetization program. And essentially, they were a freemium model. The initial pricing model was per seat. And the difference between the free and the paid model was the number of users. And so the problem with this is that people would come on and create a Miro board, invite a few users, and but not be like totally ready yet to pay yet. And so then they would be like deleting and adding users like to avoid paying. And so like it was kind of misaligned with both their growth model and how the user really thought about value. And because Miro really wanted to grow in a freemium way, they wanted that invite loop to keep spinning. They wanted more and more people to be invited and not deleted and like all that kind of stuff. So instead, they switched their pricing and their monetization model to rather than charge on the number of users, to be charged on, I believe it was like the number of Miro boards or projects. I don't know the exact word that they use, right? So that allowed people to invite unlimited users, right? Which drove even more usage on the board and got them to that monetization like value point even quicker and an increase. And so that's an example of like initially their monetization model was preventing this like viral loop from spinning, and they changed one of the dimensions, and all of a sudden it opens up the growth loop and it maintains the monetization on value capture on another way. And so that's the first thing I look at is like, is their monetization model aligned with how they want to grow? Yes or no. So we got to fix that first if that's like actually broken. The other dimension I look at is like how it aligns with their TAM. So oftentimes this is specific to venture-backed companies. If you're not a venture-backed company, I think it's a totally different scenario, which is if you take venture money, there is an expectation of the size of business that you are going to go after. And as a result, like you have to make sure that your pricing model, the amount that you can earn from a customer, times your, serviceable addressable market equals a big enough number to justify a venture back thing. And sometimes when you do that simple math, I'm like, these numbers don't add up. like this is like way too small of a number. And a lot of times, early stage teams overestimate the percentage of a market that they will be able to capture over a time. There are certainly some places where it's like winner takes all. And so you should actually if you are going for it, you should assume you're going to capture the majority of the market in the optimistic case. But there's a lot of other cases where that's like actually not true. And so that's kind of the second question I look at is like, are we pricing this thing correctly to like really build a big business? And a mistake here is like people are like, well, I'm going to underprice it to capture value initially, and then I'll raise prices over time. And yes, that's a viable strategy, but if you underprice it too much, you're actually tricking yourself into thinking you have product market fit with a specific segment of the market when you actually don't. And that's just going to bite you, down the road. It's going to cause growth issues down the road. So those are the two kind of high level questions that I typically try to evaluate first before getting into anything about optimizing the pricing page or, the monetization flow, like things like that. Those are downstream optimizations.
And one of the things I tend to focus on with people working on monetization is really understanding your value metric, which is something I learned from Reforge, which is this idea of how is the usage actually scaling as a user gets more value? And can you align your monetization with that? So as an example at Apollo.io, we realized, okay, a lot of the value is coming from the credits that a user is redeeming. So one way we were able to grow the amount we were earning per customer was to charge more for extra credits and create really beautiful sliders for different extra credits. So there's some component here of really deeply understanding kind of the right value metric to really nail your monetization.
Yeah, so the value metric is really about how do you align how you charge to how users think about getting value from your product. And that is changing dramatically actually right now with all of these new AI products. And so we went through the Miro example, which is around, okay, I charge per seat, but the thing that they're actually, the thing that actually causes them to pay is around the number of boards or projects that they've created in Miro. And that's because the signal to value is that they're creating projects, that they're creating boards, and the more that they do that, the more value that they're getting out of Miro. They're not necessarily getting value out of Miro if just by adding a user. That like it doesn't matter. Like I just by adding a user doesn't really do anything to me, do anything for me. So that's kind of like one example. And so we kind of been through a history here of I'd say over the past 10 to 15 years where most people end up charging, especially in B2B, on a per seat basis. But then, how you go and up through the tiers is essentially some type of value metric that is defined that you hit to essentially have to upgrade to the next tier. But what we're now seeing, obviously, with AI is that we're getting rid of the per seat pricing, and more companies are directly aligning to the value metric itself. Apollo, things like Clay, I know, or have a credit based system, and then a lot of the new AI companies are going all the way, not just to a value metric, but to by paying per output. And so the common examples here are things like Even Up, which is a really cool AI legal company that helps generate demand letters for a specific type of lawyers. Is they actually pay per demand letter generated, which is much closer to the value that the user is getting out of the product than paying some big seat license for their entire firm. But the closer you can get your price to the value that you're delivering, that the value that the customer feels like they're getting out of the product, typically like the less friction you have around getting somebody to pay for that product, continue to retain them on a revenue basis over time, and really have that alignment right now. And you actually see this right now where there's a lot of new AI startups that are doing output usage based pricing, attacking incumbents that are charged in different ways where the price is more disconnected from the value that the customers are getting. And so we're kind of seeing this play out in real time and real experiments about how in a specific category, just realigning how you charge can actually change how users think about and engage with you.
So we're completing the growth understanding for everybody. We've gone through retention. We dipped our toes in monetization. When it comes to acquisition, we have to introduce one of Reforge's most famous concepts, the growth loop. So why are funnels dead? And why should people think in growth loops?
Yeah. So to be clear, the funnel's not dead. That's still a viable way to look at it. Our point on growth loops was that is not how a high growth company grows, right? Funnels tend to lead you to what we call linear thinking, and where I put one of something in and I'll get something out. But then I just have to keep putting more and more things in to the top of the funnel to keep getting more things out. But if you actually look behind the engine of every high growth company, there is more of a system that looks like a self-reinforcing loop where I put an input into the system, it produces an output, and that output can be reinvested in the input. And as a result, it generates more compound interest type of investment. And so you know, virality is the obviously classic example here, right? That was like the early ones where I might put a user in, they invite two users, those two users come in and invite another two users, so on and so forth. But that loop dynamic actually takes many different shapes and forms. Content loops is another huge category, right? Where we saw a huge ecosystem pop up around user generated content. TripAdvisor was one of the earliest ones where user would come in, they'd leave a review that would get indexed by Google, which would bring in another user, and then that user would leave a review, right? Rinse and repeat. There's also paid loops, which we talk about around different types of sales mechanics and paid acquisition and those pieces. But essentially, if you want to grow at a very high pace and at a very sustainable pace, you have to build these self-reinforcing systems within your product and within your growth strategy. Otherwise, things just get worse over time. You're going to put more and more into the top of the funnel and get less and less out at the bottom. And so the most successful companies start with a core growth loop and then they expand, they layer on more of these compounding systems over time. And we're in a really interesting time right now with AI where we're seeing some of these loops kind of fundamentally change, some getting, way worse, some new ones kind of being invented as well. And it's still kind of unclear kind of how this is all going to shake out. But at the simple essence is, how do you think about your growth as a system? And how do you think about that system as generating some type of compound interest over time? And that's how you kind of continue to build a big machine.
LinkedIn launched an AI growth loop around SEO that I loved how you broke down. How did LinkedIn dominate SEO with AI?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually haven't checked in on this lately. I'd be interested to see where their traffic is at on this. And so I think everybody kind of knows probably the other types of professional Q&A sites like Quora, and their core dynamic was always a user would sign up, somebody would ask or answer a question, that content would then get indexed by Google, would bring in another user, that those steps would repeat over and over and over again. And so I can't remember how long ago, but essentially I started to see these things pop up on LinkedIn that were essentially professional kind of questions and answers. And I started to notice something that was really interesting with them, where they were solving one of the hardest friction points in that loop I just described, which is there's always friction around asking the question, getting people to ask the question, as well as jumpstarting the answers. And what they did is they actually used AI to essentially remove the friction around both of those steps. So they used AI to generate a ton of professional questions. They also used AI to essentially scope out like some bullet points under those questions. And then they exposed those questions to people on LinkedIn that they thought could answer them. And then people would come in and answer them to kind of get more visibility on LinkedIn. And so what this is doing is two things at once. It's reducing the biggest friction point in that type of user-generated content loop, but at the same time is still getting people to add content, unique content that isn't purely AI generated. And as a result, it ranks in Google and started to get a lot of traffic like very, very quickly. It was probably one of the fastest growing SEO curves that I had ever seen. And so I just think it's this really interesting example of somebody basically taking a new technology, looking at a growth loop that's been around for about over a dozen years, understanding what are the core friction points around this type of loop. How do I use this new technology to remove those friction points in order to accelerate it, but still keep a certain set of elements that like make the whole thing work. Because if they had just done it purely AI generated, I think they would have gotten knocked by Google very quickly, and it would have been a very short term mechanism. So it's just a really interesting example, and I've started to see others play with these, like essentially moving from user generated content to it's like AI generated human edited content loops. I don't know. We got to come up with a better name for that, but but I see a lot of that going on right now.
Today's episode is brought to you by Maven. The problem with most courses online, like Udemy, is there's no live component, and the instructors aren't experts in their fields, they're professors. At Maven, you get direct live access to experts and operators from the world's best tech companies. You can't get that access anywhere else, in any university, and you usually can't find them on YouTube either. I've featured so many of Maven's experts in the newsletter and podcast for that reason. To help you out, I've put together a collection of courses I recommend at maven.com/x/Aakash. This includes courses like AI prototyping for PMs, product sense for PMs, and getting an AI PM certification. Visit it now at maven.com/x/AAKASH. So once you've identified your acquisition loops, and obviously these loops really play into all elements of your business, that's why they're broadly growth loops, you want to sit down and model these. What are the different types of growth models you should be building?
Yeah, we kind of break this down into three things. We call them a qualitative growth model, a single loop quant model, and then like an end to end quant model. And you got to go in that order, 100%. So if I backed up and just asked, like, what is the purpose of a growth model? Like, why build one? The purpose is to answer the question, the very simple but complicated question: how does my product grow? And the exercise I always suggest to folks who are doing this for the first time is go ask 5 different team members to draw on a whiteboard the answer to how does your product grow. Without fail, people draw completely different pictures. And what it surfaces is essentially that everybody actually has a very different picture in their head of how our product grows, which makes no sense, right? Like think about engineering. They have like these architecture diagrams that visualize the system of how the technology infrastructure works, right? And it gets everybody on the same page, helps people identify constraints, places of optimization, like those pieces. So the fact that we wouldn't have one of those maps, those diagrams for an equally, if not more important question, which is how does our product grow is mind blowing to me. And so the qualitative growth model answers that step one. There's no numbers involved. It's literally just like a system diagram that maps out from one step to another, like user does X, which leads to Y, which leads to Z, which leads back up to X, right? It's just like those types of steps. And as a result, you can take this diagram, this picture, get everybody on the same page of like, okay, these are the key actions, these are the key steps that our users go through and what actually creates growth for us. It's not a Notion doc full of paragraphs. It's not a complicated financial spreadsheet that, nobody understands. It's just a simple diagram. That's it. And this immediately like automatically just like answers a bunch of questions in people's heads and gets people to zoom in on, oh, this step, like I know people have tons of friction with this step. I wonder if we did X, like if we could improve the conversion rate from step A to step B. And that's where we get into the single loop quant model, which is we take one of our loops in our growth model, not the whole thing, and we start to essentially build a spreadsheet around it. And the spreadsheet is essentially just a formula of conversion rates from one step, to the next. And you can make this very simple. You could also make this complicated. You could like take a single growth loop and divide it into 3 different customer segments because they actually might flow through that loop and at very different conversion rates, right? Which adds up to a total number. You could do a lot of things. But what the single loop quant model does is start to answer the next set of questions, which is, okay, how do I quantify the constraints and opportunities. So every growth loop basically has one point in the loop that is the biggest constraint, meaning it's like the biggest bottleneck to creating growth. And the quant model helps you identify that, because once you have that model, you can just start plugging in numbers to say, well, if I improve this step, what do I get out in 6 months from now? If I improve this step, what do I get out from six? And it allows you to compare and contrast those pieces. And once you have that, you can then move on to the much larger model, which is, okay, how do I quantify, the entire growth system that I mapped in that first exercise, the qualitative growth model. And this is just about how do you bring together all those single loop formulas into one view, because these loops do interact with each other, right? And it's impossible to sit there and properly identify the constraints and opportunities if you don't have something that's playing with the quantifying how the different loops interact with each other. The last bit I would say about this is that one of the things that these models do is that it helps you understand, if you change something, how there's an effect, what the effect is over a period of time. Because if you look at the thing with compounding systems, is that compound interest looks small in the short term, but very large in the long term. And so if you don't understand those mechanisms and how it compounds out over time, you can end up spending a lot of valuable resources on things that, yes, improve things in the short term, but had you worked on this other thing, it might have improved it less in the short term, but actually had a much bigger impact, over some period of time, right? And so that's why we kind of put these, that's why we put these tools together. And there's no template for this or anything. There are some patterns that you can pick up that we certainly teach within Reforge. But once again, it's like you start with the qualitative model to really help yourself understand what users are doing, why they're doing it. Then you can move on to finding the low-hanging fruit opportunities with the single loop quant model. Then you can work your way up to more of an end-to-end quant model, which becomes a really important tool for product leaders to help justify resources, prioritize initiatives, push back on the team, all those important pieces.
So that's product growth foundations and what used to be known as advanced growth series, now mastering growth strategy. Let's transition into AI, because everybody wants to learn more about AI. And in particular, I think that the traditional development cycle is ripe for disruption. I think you have an even stronger take on that. So I want to hear more about that. Why are traditional product development cycles becoming obsolete?
Yeah. So I think the conversation right now, the majority of the conversation is about, oh, product development's going to get faster, so on and so forth. And yes, that's true. But I think I've been trying to take a step back. And where I've ended up is that I think we are underestimating the impact in the short term. I actually think it's going to have a much bigger impact on product development over the long term. The way I got here is I actually went back and I looked at, okay, what were all of the things that changed as we shifted from an on-premise software model to cloud, which was one of the historical technology shifts. And basically what I ended up realizing is that, yes, the product development process changed. We moved from waterfall, which was about delivering huge chunks of software at low frequent periods, to this more iterative cycle around agile. But that had so many cascading effects. Our entire tool ecosystem and the tools that we used in product development completely changed. It also flowed through to roles that developed inside organizations and what skill sets we were expecting and how we organized teams. It also flowed through, it enabled new business models like freemium and subscription pricing, which enabled new growth models like PLG and those things. So you can actually go down through the list and you're like, oh, this just didn't change the product development process, but actually everything around it. And the reason I think we don't realize that is that happened over, I don't know how many years. There's still tons of companies that are still trying to learn these more iterative kind of development cycles and these pieces, 20 years later. And and so, but it happened over incrementally over a longer period of time. I do not think that's going to happen with AI. I actually think it's going to be a much quicker adjustment and change. And as a result, I think we were going to have what we call AI native product teams. These teams that think, work, and build differently with these AI tools. There's going to be new teams that emerge, and then there's going to be some existing teams that make that transition. And the people who embrace that the quickest, it's not just going to be about a new product development process, but they are going to find new growth mechanisms, new business model mechanisms, all those things, and the gap's just going to widen. It's just going to actually grow between AI native and non AI native teams. And so, specific to the product development process, I think we are definitely still, in a phase. There's a lot of people that are experimenting and playing around with these tools. Things like going from idea to prototype rather than idea to doc, though I would argue actually the way you get to a prototype is actually communicating first, which was the point of the doc anyways, right? So it's not totally going away, right? It's just compressed, right? Um, and there's other parts of the development cycle, but once we take care of a little bit of that low hanging fruit, there are going to be frontier teams that come up with. They're going to look at this and be like, wait a second, like, why are we going through the same steps of the product development process just faster? Why don't we take this piece out and try this other thing, right? So I know this company that actually created this team specific to just prototyping, 100 different ideas across like a few different themes, right? Before they did anything else. Totally unique. Like, and the whole team was just totally dedicated to just prototyping ideas. I know some other teams I wrote about this a little bit differently, which is like, instead of doing yearly planning in docs, it's like everybody's bringing prototypes to the table. And rather than discussing a doc, you're discussing this kind of living, breathing thing that people can touch and debate. And so, anyways, I think everybody's kind of really hyper focused on I can do these same steps faster. And yes, that will be part of it. But I think some of the best teams, the AI native product teams, are actually going to take a step back and be like, oh, actually, I can do this like totally differently, and it's going to have a totally different result. And that's what I'm really excited about in seeing kind of start to take shape because it's just, I think we're just see a lot of new exciting just ways of working as well as products that come out of it.
And one of the ways you've written about is AI collapsing the prototype test learn cycle. How is it doing that?
It's collapsing parts of it, but adding new parts in other places, and depending on what type of product you're building. And so collapsing that cycle is much more about we think about the big chunks of work. Typically, we've got to we got to design the product in Figma, then we got to write the code, then we got to release. But there's actually all this work that lives in the cracks between those big steps. And those that are in large companies are probably more in tune with this than others because there tends to be more of that type of work. And that's all of the, the stand-ups, let me communicate and progress report to leaders and management. Let me align the different teams and resolve conflict, like there's just all of this stuff. And I usually call it the work behind the work, the work behind the real work, which is the creation. And so much of that is starting to get automated in really interesting ways and augmented in really interesting ways and just becoming way more efficient. And as a result, a greater percentage of the time can be spent on the actual like creation pieces. So it's both some of the creation pieces are getting faster, but all that work in between the cracks is also being eliminated and getting faster. And as a result, you have this compressing effect. But I'm also starting to see ways that it expands in new ways. This kind of goes back to what I was just saying is like, we're going to make some things more efficient, but we're also going to add and do some new things. So one of the things that I'm seeing add is that teams can actually explore more directions in the same period of time than they could before. So they actually might not do the discovery step faster. They just might explore more pathways within that discovery step. And both are totally viable paths to getting to a better product outcome, which is ultimately what we all care about, right? Like that's why we're building. So there's that kind of piece of it. Also, if you're building an AI product, that has non-deterministic outcomes, is you've got this whole new thing that you have to do, which is called evaluations, which is that I can't just write a PRD and test it to according to that spec, because even the same inputs into AI features create different outputs. And instead I have to create all of these evaluations where every time I make a change, I'm essentially running through a benchmark set of scenarios to say, okay, is this behaving properly or not? Right. And that's actually adding a lot of time for people in the development cycle, but is actually a really important piece if you're trying to tune and improve an AI feature and product. And so I see it both collapsing as well as expanding in different parts. And I think part of this is that as we remove friction around some things, um, we will always we tend to find ways to fill those holes. so so right, like it's human nature, right? So the number of times I've sat in the company, I'm like, oh man, I wish I could do this analysis or go get this customer feedback or so on. But I'm like, oh, the friction to that and the cost and the time, just too much. Like I'm just not going to do it. Right. And PMs are doing that every single day. And I don't blame you. Like I'm not talking down on that. It's just like, it's reality. And what a lot of these systems are doing is, as they eliminate that friction, all of a sudden these things that used to be high cost to do, actually the cost reward ratio ends up being worth it, and they can do it. And so we've seen this with we just launched Reforge Insight Analytics, which aggregates all the different sources of your customer feedback from sales, support, success, user research, products, public sources, everything to one place. Uses AI to analyze it. You can use natural language to analyze it. It combines it with all your quantitative metrics, like all these things. And so an analysis that would have taken you, I don't know, weeks to do, right? To like get all this data together, marry it with the quant data, synthesize it, like all that kind of stuff, can actually be done in like minutes to less than an hour. And as a result, like questions that were not being pursued before are now being pursued by teams. They're now being analyzed by teams. And so the same kind of goes with like quant analysis and stuff. And so all of these things, I think we got to remember at the end of the day, as we make things more frictionless, there will probably be new things that fill those gaps, new activities for us to do.
We're seeing so much hype around AI prototyping in particular, and that's part of the collapse side of the house, people say, although as you said, it may not be, because it might actually allow you to prototype more things, but people are thinking it's part of the collapse side, it's part of the making things much faster. And actually next on the podcast, we have Colin Matthews, who's an AI prototyping expert. But sometimes I think what's getting lost in all this hype is like, wait, why is this actually valuable to us? Like, why is it so useful for PMs to prototype?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with speed. Like that's the thing. Is like prototyping is not about speed. That's not the value. The value is that, let me start with the problem. The problem is that when we express ideas and solutions in words, in documents, that everybody has a different picture of that. There's no level of precision to words that will let you perfectly capture and align people's like pictures of what this thing should be in their heads. And especially when you have a user sitting on the other side of this thing that has to actually use this thing. And so what the value of a prototype is not about speed. It's about, okay, how do we get everybody to have the same picture in their head, align around the experience that we're trying to actually accomplish, like physically understand what is delightful about this and where is the friction? It's all about those pieces. It's not about speed at all. And so Christopher O'Donnell, who was the chief product officer at HubSpot and now has this AI CRM startup called Day, wrote a little bit about his new way of working in the product development process. And one of the things that he talks about is like how they immediately jump into prototyping and just the value of being able to touch, feel, and discuss this like living thing and how different it is. But he also talks about oftentimes they sleep on it and they throw the prototype out and they start all over again. And there's value in that. There's like real value in that of being able to like go through that process. So if we went back to an old adage of like, a picture is worth 1,000 words, I think a prototype's probably worth 10,000, 10x on that. So anyways, like I think that to me is at the end of the day, like the real value and ultimately at the end of the day, the real value is just building more compelling products for customers. Right. And it is a path. It is a path to that.
So now you guys can understand why you might want to pick up that skill. I want to transition from mastering AI to AI strategy here at the end. You've said traditional product metrics don't work well for AI products that create a different experience for every user and learn over time. So how should AI products be measured?
Well, they can and they can't. All right. Like this is going to be the tricky part. And there's going to be some new metrics framework that I hopefully Reforge comes up with to help provide more precision and guidance, around this. But as I think I mentioned earlier, is I think a mistake when building AI products is that we throw out the foundational principles that we talked about, which is retention makes or breaks you in a category, and that your retention starts with your use case and your natural frequency. All these things are still like 100% true. Um, but at the same time, there's like some new dimensions that we need to consider. And one is, the two clearest ones right now are one is that, once again, the non deterministic nature of these features that a same user can put in the same input and get two different outputs. And so as a result, like understanding whether or not the product fulfilled its intention across hundreds, thousands, millions of users, where each experience is completely unique and different and not operating to a defined set of rules that we encoded and instead is probabilistic. It's just different, right? And so it's interesting, like some companies, the first wave of this in chatbots was essentially, the thumbs up, the thumbs down. And people were kind of monitoring that metric, though that has like a lot of problems with it to like understand satisfaction. And in some of the best products, most AI native products actually build this right into the core user interaction, right? So the classic example here is Midjourney, where they generate not one image but four different images for you based off of prompt, and based on the one you select and decide to upscale and all that kind of stuff, gives them a much better indication of what is working and what isn't working for them in the product in the generation, or not selecting something, right? Like that also like gives them an indication, and it's a core part of the user flow versus this thing that has been sort of like tacked on, like the thumbs up and the thumbs down. The second piece of that is what we already touched on, which is like, okay, evaluations. And how do I basically generate a benchmark set of use cases across my product, define clear measurement criteria for, after I made this change to the AI system, is it performing better or worse? That's can be highly subjective. And then being able to consistently do that as part of your product development process over and over and over again. And not only that, monitor how these systems like drift and change over time because they're not static. The other dimension on this is what we talked about with monetization, with all these companies moving to more output-based pricing models in usage is that our classic definition of ARR and retention, monetization, retention, and those types of pieces fundamentally changed too, right? Like output-based pricing is no longer true recurring revenue in the way that we have previously defined it. Um, and last but not least, you got like costs, like real costs associated with this. And we used to not pay attention. Part of most product managers did not have to think about infrastructure costs as part of the success metrics that they drove. All of a sudden, you do, like in a lot of different cases, if you're doing this at scale. So, anyways, there's all these. It's how you frame success, and I think as a product manager, you got to be thinking about success for the user and the business at the same time. And there's differences in building AI products for both the user experience as well as the business metrics that you're trying to optimize for. And so I think we'll see new evolutions of this over time.
It's really interesting. Most people might not have ever used Google Gemini, but Gemini Nano is really succeeding because it's so cheap. The cost matters, and any PM actually building an AI feature would have actually evaluated Gemini Nano because it's so cheap, but your everyday user may not have thought about it. So that's a very big difference that AI products have. Another interesting element of AI product strategy is understanding what problems you are best suited to solve. How can you do that?
With such a cool technology like what we've seen in AI, one of the easiest mistakes to make is people take the cool technology in pursuit of a problem rather than starting with the problem and asking, hey, is this cool technology the right thing? And so the key question is like in your use case, in your category, what are the learning problems in learning solutions that you can build that you might not have been able to build before? Because for 20 years, we've been thinking about computational problems, taking a problem and asking the question, can we essentially write a set of code that captures and creates the solution for this like specific problem in a complete way? And we've ignored all the things that are like too complex, too many edge cases, right? That we can never express in code. And we got to somehow rewire our brains to flip that. And all of a sudden consider actually there's this whole new greenfield of problems and solutions that are called learning problems where we actually don't need to know all of the rules. All we need is a set of inputs and a bunch of examples of the outputs, and we can design a system that writes the rules for us. And that's just, it's sounds simple, but I think is actually it's a more complicated thing to like wrap your head around and like rewire yourself, rewire yourself out of.
That's the first rewiring. And then the next question you have to ask is, well, how do you design effective learning loops into your AI products?
Most AI product experiences are built off of a foundational set of building blocks, like these foundational models. And these foundational models are really good at a lot of things, but lack in a lot of areas, right? And you basically have to augment their abilities with things like more reasoning, more memory, more knowledge, like those types of pieces to get it to do the thing that you want it to do. One of the things that it is not able to do on its own is essentially improve itself over time. And but there are a bunch of new methodologies that are emerging to do this, and you want to design systems so that it can improve over time because the problems we were talking about earlier, which is in learning problems and these probabilistic natures across hundreds, thousands, millions of users, right? It's going to create a really good experience for a certain percentage of users, but it's going to fail in others. It's going to create like a really bad experience. And you want this thing to essentially learn from all of the failed and successful scenarios to like get better and better over time. And so as a result, you need to build in these like learning mechanisms so that it can basically self-reinforce and learn over time. Some people have implemented these like mechanisms that you layer on top of the experience, the thumbs up, the thumbs down, the surveys, Some people like monitor the outputs, right? And then there's these ones that are built into your user experience as well, like the Midjourney example. That's one dimension of these metrics. The other dimension is kind of implicit or explicit, which is, are you or you, another way to put it is like are they a passive? Is it passive feedback or non-passive feedback? So passive feedback would just be uh, looking at the actual usage data and inferring, like, did somebody have a good experience from this output or not? Did I type something into Lovable and continue to edit it? Probably a signal that it did a good thing, like on the first prompt. Did I type something into Lovable and then just like delete it and start from scratch? Probably didn't work, right? And so there, in both of those cases, I've got an input, I have an output, and I have a label of like this thing was successful or not successful, right? So you can gather that data passively, or it's specifically expressed by the user through some other type of feedback mechanism. But product managers need to think about how they're going to design the product upfront to include these mechanisms, because you will never be able to, once again, write the explicit rules or code for all the edge cases of the output and like capture those things. You have to design a system that works well for the majority, but gets better and better over time as more people use it, more edge cases emerge, to actually improve. We can't just write more code.
So that concludes our crash course into some of the things that you could learn at Reforge. I want to shift to you a little bit. After bootstrapping for 5 years profitably, you raised a Series A from A16Z. You raised a huge Series B. I think you grew the team massively as a result also. In retrospect now, early 2025, are you happy with those decisions?
Yes. And so the reason is, I think the mistake that a lot of founders can make is, the job of a founder essentially is you are taking a series of bets around ambiguous situations over and over and over again. Like, that's just the job, right? You are making series of bets off of imperfect information. And so my question for founders is, when they are kind of going back and thinking about all the decisions that they had to make over time, is not, was that a good or bad decision in hindsight? The question is, given the information I had at the time, was that a good or a bad decision? And that's what you should ultimately try to judge yourself on. Otherwise, you are just going to pummel yourself, beat yourself up into a terrible situation. And so when I look back at those time periods with the information that I had, do I think it was still a good decision or not? And the answer is yes. The metric, just everything we had, the metrics of the business, what we were hearing from the customers, the way that the market was accelerating, the talent we were able to bring, like all these pieces. And now in hindsight, we now know a few things that we could have never predicted at the time, which was the whiplash of COVID, the tech market crash after that, the huge emergence of AI and what disruption that's going to bring to like education and learning. Like if you predicted all of those things back then, please let me know. I will give you all of my money to make the next set of predictions. But my guess is you're full of BS if you're saying that you called all of those things out. And so yeah, I don't. Those were still, I think, good decisions at the time. Additionally, we haven't spent any of that Series B money. We still have it, all of it. And so as a result, it's actually enabling a huge new opportunity that I never thought would have existed when I started Reforge, which is that we are going through this massive shift we talked about to AI native product teams. And that is going to be both a combination of new knowledge, new skill sets, new learning, but also new, really exciting tools and products to help product teams. And that window opened for us. and we're super well capitalized. We have all of this knowledge and history, like around some of the best performing product teams. We have a huge distribution into that audience, like all of these pieces. And so that's kind of the opportunity that we're pursuing now. And I don't think that opportunity might have existed had we not like raised those rounds in those pieces. And so at the end of the day, I'll judge the collection of decisions, whenever Reforge ends, whatever capacity that is in. But around those specific decisions, I think those were still good decisions, knowing the things that we knew at the time. Now, that being said, there are a lot of decisions that I've made along the way that I think are bad. so, that I made bad decisions with the information I had at the time, but not those two.
I think judging yourself based on the information you actually had at the time might be one small part of the answer to this next question, but I'm really keen on understanding because you shared on Andrew Kaplan's podcast that you had experienced some burnout as a founder. And I think so many of us do, and very few of us are honest with ourselves or others about experiencing that burnout. So I wanted to hear so that others could resonate, how did you end up overcoming that burnout and coming back better than ever?
Yeah, look, like I think everybody kind of hits these moments. Uh, it's it's kind of impossible not to if you're trying to do something super big and ambitious that you're like deeply passionate about. So for context, this happened about a year ago now. And so a year ago, I was about 9 years into Reforge. I had been through solo founding, 5 years of bootstrapping, two big venture rounds, the COVID boom, the COVID whiplash back, the market downturn, the start of, like the emergence of AI. During that time, my wife and I had three children, one that unfortunately like passed away at birth, and then two healthy ones, and kind of adjusting to that, like adjusting to like that new life. All of these pieces. And yeah, I went from my young 30s to my early 40s. Right? Like just all of those things. And and it all just like ended up adding up at some point where I hadn't ever like really taken a break, like really taken a break from those things. And I actually, in that time period, ended up finding out I had a couple diagnosed with like a couple sleep disorders. I could talk to you about sleep and sleep optimization for like 10 hours if you want to at some point. I didn't know those were going on. And I kind of just like, I just hit a wall. I never thought, I had never like experienced true burnout before, but I just like remember waking up and feeling like I couldn't function. I couldn't sit in front of the computer or other thing. I like literally felt like something was on the verge of breaking inside. Um, and uh, and so very fortunate. Our COO Tom Willer and a couple others in the org is like I had a conversation with them, and literally 24 hours later they had everything taken care of, and I pieced out from the business for a few months. Um, and and I deleted Slack, I deleted email, I deleted it all. I deleted it all. And I got like a few really high quality months away from things. I started figuring out the sleep stuff. Uh, and and it was like a great sort of like recharge period. Now I kind of now having gone through that experience, I understand like the signals of like when I'm starting to approach that point, and as a result, I can, do things to prevent it from, the flywheel spinning, that in that far of a negative direction. But it's hard to recognize it in the moment. It's really hard to recognize it in the moment is kind of one of my major takeaways. And unfortunately, like in some cases, it's like, oh man, you just kind of you got to experience to know what it feels like to understand to like not do it again. So I hope you all don't out there experience those types of more moments. They are not fun, but they're also opportunities at the same time.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I think a lot of people have hit some fraction of that at least. And I think hearing, that you've made it over the other side, I think is really awesome. So if people want to learn more and help you, how can they do that?
Oh yeah, well look, we always welcome. We'd love people to come check out Reforge, our courses. We have a spring cohort coming up soon, with a few new AI courses created by some heavy hitters that we haven't announced yet. So I'm really excited about those. We've got the new product, Reforge Insight Analytics. Would love to show you a personalized demo. Just drop a note in the book a demo, and I'm happy to jump on with you. But other than that, I'm publishing mostly on LinkedIn these days, and we'll be starting. We'll be doing. I have a few things brewing that will go on my personal site too, which is brianbalfour.com. But yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Reach out. I appreciate it.
And don't miss unsolicited feedback. That's one of those podcasts I listen
Yes,
to as well.
yes. The Unsolicited Feedback is a podcast with a very irregular posting schedule. Just a warning, I am not as good as Aakash. Fareed and I kind of have started to do it when we feel like it, though we have another episode coming out soon. I just got to finish up the editing.
Cool. If you guys are a fan of All In or more of the group show element, they have a lot of that going. So Brian, huge fan. Took your courses, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. Great to finally meet and jam for a little while.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find out about the podcast. You can find all the past episodes or learn more about the show at product-growth.com. See you in the next episode.